But let's chat outlook for commodities, and joining in right now is Gary Shilling. He's a renowned investor and money manager joining in on the show. Thank you so much for taking time out and joining us on ET Now. To begin with, Mr. Shilling, what do you make of the trade data that has been released by China for December? It's the slowest import and export growth since 2016. Are we staring at a prolonged period of slowdown in China?
Well, matter of fact, Chinese economy is definitely slowing. They've got some basic problems. They've been driven historically by exports, and now, particularly with the trade wars, that growth has obviously dropped considerably. They've also used infrastructure spending in lieu of export growth, but that's resulted in lots of ghost cities, excess capacity, and huge debts. So that is not working. China is trying to switch over to be a consumer-led economy, but that takes a long time. They don't really have developed social safety nets for old age pensions and healthcare and so on. So that's a long-term project, but I think China's economy is going to continue to slow in terms of growth.
Now, despite this, the high-stakes trade war China announced the largest trade surplus versus the US in a decade. Do you think that this has to do more with front-loading of orders ahead of the implementation of tariffs?
Well, it's all of the above. Certainly there was a front-end loading of orders to get goods shipped to the U.S. before the tariffs were imposed. But also the Chinese imports growth has been slowing as their economy atrophies. So it's partly the trend in Chinese growth, but also this one-time attempt to get ahead of the tariffs.
Now, what do you think is the worst turn that the ongoing US-China trade talks could take?
Well, the worst concern is that there is no deal, and that President Trump and Chinese President Xi, who's basically president for life, he got himself into that position, that they really go to the mat, that there isn't any deal, that becomes an all trade war. And that could be very, very disruptive, particularly to China, less so to the U.S. We don't have nearly the dependence on foreign trade that China does, but it could drag in the rest of the world. We probably would get a global recession if there is no deal.
Now, China's frequent economic indicators are underpinning fears of a slowdown. In light of that, do you think China could be under pressure to accept a deal with Trump, even if it may not be the most ideal?
Oh, yeah, China's definitely under pressure. There are several reasons. One is when you have plenty of supply of goods and services in the world, which we do, it's the buyer that has the upper hand. And the U.S. is the buyer, not the seller. The seller is China. That's where you start. Then on top of that, you have the slowing growth in China, which makes it a lot of pressure on them to reach a deal. So I think all around the U.S. has the upper hand in these trade negotiations now, and I think eventually that China will give way. They'll end up importing more from the U.S. There'll be less restraints on American operations in China, less demand for technological transfer, less stealing of U.S. technology. So I think in the end that will be the U.S. that wins. But it's a matter of short-term pain versus long-term gain, because when you have these really sea change, important developments, it's very disruptive. The supply chains are being disruptive. But of course, another thing that China has to worry about is that supply chains are shifting outside of China. Now, low-end production already was moving out of China into cheaper areas, Bangladesh, Vietnam, Pakistan, and so on. But on top of that, American companies are moving their production, even more sophisticated production from China, into these other countries just to get out of the way of these trade wars. So the longer this goes, the less advantageous it is for China. But China has a tremendous problem here because they see themselves growing by technology. They see themselves becoming the most important and perhaps even in time the largest economy in the world. So their method of growing, basically adapting Western technology and demanding tech transfer and stealing it, it'll be very, very difficult for them to give up on that model because they don't really have any alternative.
Who do you think will be then the biggest victims of the U.S.-China trade war?
Well, China is obviously a loser in this, but not alone, because you do have these supply chain disruptions. You look at countries like Taiwan, for example, South Korea, that have huge involvement in the supply chains. And as these things get readjusted, they too would suffer. So it just isn't China. It's really a whole host of countries. But again, the U.S., well, we're largely a domestic economy. Our exports are 13% of GDP. China, they're 20%. You go to Europe, a country like Germany, over 50% of their GDP is exports. They're very strong exporters to China. So these other countries outside the U.S., just because they are much more oriented, much more dependent on foreign trade, are much more likely to be affected than the U.S.
And in other media reports, you mentioned that the Fed's tightening cycle could trigger a recession. Do you think this would be triggered on account of the effects of higher rates that you would have on EMs?
Well, yeah, we're looking for a recession. We explored that in detail in our January newsletter. Insight gave 13 recession forerunners, and one of them was what's happening in emerging markets. Now, the idea of a recession here, higher interest rates, that is an effect because it attracts money from emerging markets to the U.S. It's a safer place to be. And 2017, there was a big rush into emerging markets. Investors didn't think they were getting good returns in developed countries, so they were moving into those areas despite the higher risk. But now with U.S. interest rates rising, it's shifting the other way. But the biggest threat to emerging markets, in our view, is the fact that so many of them have borrowed very heavily in dollars. That borrowing was very cheap right after the Great Recession, the 2007-2009 recession, and many of these emerging markets gorged themselves with dollar borrowing. Now, the problem there is that the dollar has been strong. And as the dollar rises, it simply takes more of their local currencies to service those debts. I mean, and on top of that, those that import commodities, we've got a list of 45 commodities, and 42 or 45 are traded in dollars. And as the dollar goes up, their import costs in local currencies rises. If you look at Turkey, for example, they import almost all of their energy. If you look at crude oil prices, Brent crude, the international standard, it's actually down from where it was at the beginning of 2017. But in Turkish lira terms, it's up over 50%. It's much more expensive. So I think it's the combination of higher interest rates in these countries, but also the stronger dollar that is very, very difficult for emerging markets.
All right, we'll let you go on that note. Thank you so much. That's the word coming in from Gary Shilling, talking about the outlook on commodities, the U.S.-China trade talk concerns as well.